Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's really a great pleasure to be back, and it's always good to see you again and to see old friends here again and make new friends. And it's really quite an honor that the philosophy department at Universidad de Caldas has gone through the trouble of inviting me back here, and I appreciate everyone's efforts very much. I always really enjoy coming to Colombia in general, and certainly to Manizales. I find the city actually very impressive and beautiful. It's kind of a mountaintop city, and it's really quite extraordinary with a lot of different things to do. And the philosophy department at Universidad de Caldas is, first of all, it's very special to me. Because several of its participating members are people who I got to know when they were graduate students, including you and including Professor Flores and Professor Acosta, who's working at several different places here in Manizales. And so it's always great to be back. I think the International Festival of Philosophy, this first one, is a wonderful venture and a wonderful outcome. One of the things that I've heard, I'm not necessarily so familiar with, but I've heard, is that even here in Colombia, in departments of philosophy, it's far more prevalent for those departments of philosophy to be really steeped in the traditions of Western philosophy and European philosophy. And there's, from everyone that I've spoken to, it's still too rare. Even in philosophy departments in Colombia, for Latin American philosophers to be read, certainly for traditions and thinkers from indigenous cultures within Colombia to be read. And I think that this first International Festival of Philosophy can be a great help in sort of kickstarting much greater attention to Latin American and Colombian indigenous traditions, as well as to intercultural philosophy in general. So I think it's a fantastic and opportunity and a very promising one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the ideas that we put forward in this festival was trying to see how philosophy has been written and expressed in different traditions, but also like here we do a comparative philosophy, like philosophy with music, ways of teaching philosophy, philosophy with literature, and this allows us to see, because the program in itself is philosophy and literature, and so we try to amplify the version of the way normally philosophy is taught in different places.
Yes.
So your experience here in Manizales, do you were surprising for you to get in this conversation of non-Western philosophy, especially in traditions like Chinese tradition and Indian traditions of philosophy? Were you surprised by the way students and the public ask you questions about your perspective or your ideas of this comparative philosophy?
Actually, to be honest, I'm not as surprised I'm not really surprised by the enthusiasm and interest, and very often surprisingly well-informed sort of curiosity of the students. In many cases, not just here, but in other places that I've been, I found the students to be far ahead of the administrators and sometimes sort of department structures when it comes to interest in philosophical traditions of other cultures. I taught in Canada for about a year and a half in the past, and Canadian institutions, like American institutions, very often struggle with incorporating different traditions of thought into their philosophy curricula as well as curricula in other areas. But the students were enormously enthusiastic about it, and I think to the surprise, actually, of some of the administrators and faculties. That's also been the case in the Netherlands so far, where I've been teaching for the last 2 years, going on 3, where we just opened and initiated a new program in intercultural philosophy, global and comparative philosophy it's called. And the first year we were able to retain almost 30 majors. The second year we were able to retain more than 50. And this third year we've got more than 60 actually that were signed up. And these numbers have actually effectively doubled the size of the entire Institute for Philosophy and made it the largest institute for philosophy in the Netherlands. And so there's been an enthusiastic reception among the students. And so when I come to Colombia and I find interest and enthusiasm and often high degrees of information among students as well as maybe other community members or university participants, I'm not surprised by that. I'm perhaps encouraged actually by the fact that that level of enthusiasm may push departments and administrations to expand actually into these
great,
areas.
Yeah. Coming just back to this idea of, given your experience of traveling around the world and being immersed in different cultures. I mean, you lived in Japan for a while.
Yeah.
You've been visiting China. You also been, in the United States, of course, most of your time. I'm pretty sure it's not really surprising for you to get to a different country and to find, food, the music, or the culture in general.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there is any particular kind of, cultural expression that you find unique in Manizales, or is this your first time in Colombia? I mean, in Manizales, right? But do you find any particular cultural characteristic of this place that you find challenging, interesting, or something like just appealing? I don't know.
Well, there are all kinds of things about it so far that are quite appealing to me. I know certainly that in many places there are challenges and difficulties and things that have to be confronted in society. And in some respects, as a short-term visitor, I'm immune from those things in an unfortunate way. I should be exposed to more of them. I think that one of the things that I've found wonderful so far and really appealing about my experience in Colombia and specifically in Manizales, and it sort of reminds me a little bit, as a matter of fact, of experiences that I've had in China, is that the people that I've met are very enthusiastic about very quickly forming very good relationships and friendships and so forth, that the personal relations in a lot of respects are primary, and they sort of come in some ways before the professional expectations and so forth, and I find that very appealing, right? I mean, they take kind of unique forms, uniquely different and local forms in Colombia and in China, but I always like that very much about visiting.
And given that this was very particular yesterday about the strike, were you surprised by right in the middle of this festival, that many of the participants in the festival also were part of this strike? Do you find it interesting, surprising, that that's very common in different places where you've been teaching?
Well, I find it quite encouraging. I think that the several things that encouraged me about it and that were really impressive to me were, one, sort of there's a real strong continuity here between sort of a commitment to the intellectual project, to the philosophical project, to education in general, and a commitment to social change, actually, and to social transformation and reform and betterment, right? That these things are not separated from one another in ways that sort of they might be separated from one another in other places, either because of people's inclinations, or because in some places of a sort of really strong prevention of the government from these social influences to form on the basis of academic commitments. And I was at least sort of when I was out during the day and witnessing the protest, I was quite impressed by really the effectiveness of Colombians to come out and to raise their voices and to be united and really make their desires heard. I think that's very powerful and very impressive. Yeah.
And now, coming just back to the last lecture that you gave us today, I was impressed with the way you describe the comparative philosophy versus intercultural philosophy. You make that distinction. Why do you think that distinction is so fundamental for this approach that you're taking in doing philosophy in the non-Western context?
Yeah. A comparative philosophy is still a very contested term. The global and comparative philosophy at Leiden University, where I now work, for instance, was named that before I got there, and had I gotten there first, it would have been named something else, perhaps. But comparative philosophy and the value of that label is still actually contested within the field. There are essentially two reasons why I am not inclined to really prefer the label comparative philosophy. One of them is that I think it's both in some respects superficial, you know, sort of it sounds like someone going to a grocery store and doing comparative shopping. Should I buy this vegetable or that vegetable or something like that? But it also sort of carries the danger that, okay, we're going to compare two traditions so that I can decide which one is better.
Okay.
I can sort of come to,
like a standard.
yeah, I can come to some kind of definitive conclusion that can be closed, you know, sort of about which one is better. The other danger of it, I think, is perhaps more, it's not exactly the same, but it's more along historicist lines, that I'm looking at these traditions merely to draw comparisons and contrasts, and just to catalog those.
Oh, okay.
And so intercultural philosophy strikes me as more, far more appealing and far more fitting, partly because the philosophical activity is intercultural in that the different cultures that are engaging in the conversation are being challenged to rethink their assumptions, their frameworks, their categories, and so forth. And the other thing that appeals to me about it is that cultures are not going to disappear, they're not going to stop transforming, and so intercultural philosophy is an ongoing activity of conversation between whole societies and whole communities, rather than an enterprise where someone is just sort of encouraged to come to some fixed and final decision and assessment about another tradition from the perspective of a second one. And so,
yeah. And another question I was wondering when I was hearing your lecture, and also because you have published a lot of books and also papers about doing this kind of philosophy. It's very uncommon to find philosophical perspectives written by women, and this is especially true in Western culture. I don't know if that's the same in these traditions that you've been working in the Oriental or the Asian traditions.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about classical Asian texts, I mean, I think the general presumption, historically speaking, which is probably generally a sound assumption, is that most of the texts that we have that survive from different cultural traditions were written by men. Although it's very difficult to determine exactly, because the whole issue of authorship for ancient text is a very tricky one. In the case of a lot of ancient texts, what you probably have is a kind of a collection of writings from different people. And even though text might be attributed to a certain author historically, very often those attributions are legendary. They're not easy to pin down and so forth. There are also texts in certain religious traditions in the Asian context that were written by women and for women, actually. So there are a few texts in the history of the Confucian tradition from the 2nd century to even the 17th and 18th century that were very specifically written by women for other women. There are some texts in the Buddhist tradition in the history that are specifically rules for monastic practice for nuns, right, rather than for monks. And so there are conspicuous exceptions. I think one of the things that's happening now is, particularly in the East Asian context, is we find more and more texts that were written by women from all of these traditions. And that's increasing in modern scholarship. And I actually want to myself participate in this, because I happen to edit a book series for the University of Hawaii Press called Dimensions of Asian Spirituality. We produce textbooks for the undergraduate classroom on different traditions. And one of the things that I'm trying to, the press has approved it, so I'm in the process of finding contributors now, would be a 2 or 3 volume mini-series on spirituality of women, right, in Asian traditions. So I think this is, there's some precedent in classical Asian traditions for texts being written by women for women. That's increasing, certainly in the last century and a half in Asian traditions, and hopefully that will continue.
Great. And the last question, and are you working on some specific project? Are you interested in doing some, I mean, all besides, of course, the teaching and the traditions that you've been doing research for a long time. Are you working on a specific book, on a specific tradition at the moment?
The next, I'm working on different essays about this and that here or there, but the next major project I actually want to undertake, and I'm going to attempt to get funding from either the Dutch sort of national scholarly organization or the European Research Council. I intend to submit a grant. And the project that I want to undertake is this one. One of the roadblocks to Asian philosophical traditions to be accepted as sincerely philosophical traditions in Western programs has been certainly the unfamiliarity of Westerners, but also the unfamiliarity of Western scholars with what were very long-standing and very overt and very robust approaches to formal argumentation in Asian traditions. And there was a lot of focus to forms of logical argumentation and forms of argumentation that were based on various discursive strategies and philosophy of language. These existed in the Indian tradition, in major Brahminical and Buddhist and Jain schools. They existed in the Chinese tradition among so-called the Moista tradition and school of names. And so what I would like to do is to sort of spearhead a project that would involve not just my writing, but also the contribution of PhD students and postdocs to put together a kind of a multi-volume collection that are devoted to explicating forms of argument, actually, in classical Indian and Chinese traditions. And I think this might sort of help in kind of the long-term cause of convincing Western philosophers that these are philosophical traditions.
Yeah. Well, Professor Douglas Berger, thank you so much for your time, for your dedication, for sharing with us all your ideas, your perspectives that you've been working on for a long time. I guess you've been working on for the last 20 years at least, dedicated to this work. We really appreciated your staying here. We would like you to come back at some moment and to keep in contact with our university and probably to the place you're working on.
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure for me. Thank you for having me, and I very much would look forward to coming back.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.